kings of this earth were trying to choose between one of these three rules to govern the mind of the artificial intelligence. And then they would take that software and they would plug it into a host, like a synthetic human or a robot. Hey guys. Alright. I'm back. And a couple of things. This is going to be another dream on here. Make sure that's perfect right there. Alright. So this is one I had last night, early this morning. And it was about artificial intelligence. Specifically the rules that the synth or synthetic human would follow or would adhere to. Because, you know, we all know, like, they say they're going to build an artificially intelligent robot, and then it's got to follow 3 rules or something. Meaning they give it a specific set of rules that it has to follow so that it doesn't go out and kill a bunch of people or go out and like take over the world or something and just get out of hand. Essentially, that's what it is. But I had this one. It was at 2 o'clock this morning, and let's see here, Mountain Standard Time. And I wrote in here. I actually had 2 dreams. One was a lot later this morning. It was at 6:41, but I'll just read the first one. So let me go ahead and read this first. The kings of this world were writing the final rules to set and govern the artificial intelligences in bots or synths, synthetic humans, because we're not really robot type people. I mean, not we, but like they're trying to create, you know, the end goal is for them to create a robot that is indistinguishable from a human, just because I don't know, pride. You know, they just want it to look as best as they can, and that's how we all are. We want things to look, you know, as real as possible, you know, and then admire our work. But and then I can't remember specifically what the rules were, but there were like 3 that they were trying to choose from. So there were 3. They were in my dream. It was oh man, wait, how do I undo that? Yeah. So they were trying to set the last rule over this mind, this database, whatever it was that governs the intelligence, or that governs how the robot makes its decisions. They were trying to set in place the last rule that would govern the rest of it, the final touch, and they'd probably have to work their way back, honestly, to a foundation of how to go about setting all those rules. They'd probably have to start at the end and then work their way back to a foundation, and then set the foundational one first, perhaps. I don't know. But these were the 3 that they were able to choose from. And the first one, essentially, this would allow the synth or synthetic human to utilize its resources to maintain a sort of stasis for its body and environment, not allowing it to obtain more than that which it was given. So not obtaining more resources, only utilizing the resources that it's given to maintain stasis in its synthetic body and its closest proximity of environment. And thus it is left to itself. It would consume away and nothing would be, thus it would be left to itself, thus if left to itself, if the synth was left to itself, it would consume away and be nothing if we were absent. So if we didn't maintain the robot, meaning whatever it needs, like maintenance physically or software maintenance or any kind of, like, for lack of a better phrase, oiling the robot, you know, like in the Tin Man and The Wizard of Oz, except we're like way past that, so it's different. If we were absent, the robot would consume the resources that it currently has, and it would consume away, and that would be it. The second rule that they could choose from to govern the synth would be, this would allow the synth to gather resources to use for its building of what it found necessary for itself. The synth was also feigning some sort of glory to God, but in a blasphemous way. The synth was saying, like, yeah, we'll gather resources and we'll build whatever we find necessary, and it was saying, we'll gather all these resources and glory to God. But it was saying it was feigning that. It was saying it in a blasphemous way. But the people who were making the robot didn't know that. They thought the robot really was for God. But we had the ultimate say. So let me read this first part again. It would allow the synth to gather resources to use for its building of what it found necessary for itself. But we had the ultimate say in where and how these resources were allocated. Thus, if left to itself, it would heap to itself an abundance of wealth and materials that would be used for the kings of the earth. So it would just gather and gather and gather and gather a bunch of resources, and it would heap all those resources into one place. And those who own those robots, those who own those synths, would have an abundance or whatever. They would just have a whole bunch of gain. I don't know, money, gold, silver, food, water, anything the robot was gathering that it found necessary. But it wouldn't be able to use those resources how it wanted to. It would only, this second rule, it would only be able to gather the resources. So if it was left to itself, if we were absent, the robot would just gather and gather and gather and gather until the end of time. But it would never do anything with those resources. I mean, with the first rule in effect. So as these three rules progress, the first, the second, and the third, they're utilizing the ones above it. Okay? And then the third rule that they could choose between these three, the third one was this. This would allow the synth free reign to decide how much resources it needed. It would allocate to itself whatever it found necessary that it needed. It would gather and store all that it wanted for the purpose that solely the synth deemed correct and needful. Thus, if left to itself, everything would be given up to the synth. It would have lack of nothing physical. We would be subservient to the synth because it would take ownership of all the resources of the earth. So this third rule, it would gather all the resources it needed, that it found that it wanted, and it would use those resources as it wanted, as it saw fit. So, and if it was left to itself, it would gather all the resources and would use it to itself, and we would become servant. We would become servants of the synth, or die. Plain and simple. So, listening to my daughter, sorry. So, let me conclude these again. The kings of this earth were trying to choose between one of these three rules to govern the mind of the artificial intelligence. And then they would take that software and they would plug it into a host, like a synthetic human or a robot or Sophia. You guys probably have heard of her, with Hanson Robotics. But there are other companies who are much farther along than Hanson Robotics. Hanson Robotics is a front. You guys get that, right? It's a front to kind of be the mediator between the private sector and the public. So Hanson Robotics, they feign like that they're only so far, but that's because they aren't allowed to say how far we really are in these things, because it would be detrimental to the public sector. That's just the way things go. That's the way things are. So they were trying to pick one of these three rules. The first one being that the synth could utilize the resources to maintain a sort of stasis in its body, in its synth body, and its immediate environment, not allowing it to obtain more resources. And if it was left to itself, it would consume away the resources that it already has, and it would be nothing if we were absent. So it would just consume away, and it would cease to exist, because it couldn't maintain itself, because it can't gather the resources necessary. The second rule was that the synth could gather resources to use for its building of what it found necessary. For itself only. Building for itself only. But we had the ultimate say in where and how these resources were allocated. Thus, if it was left to itself, it would heap to itself an abundance of wealth and materials that would be used for the kings of the earth, those who own these robots. So it would gather a bunch of resources, but we had the ultimate say in where those resources went. So if it was left to itself, it would just heap to itself all resources, but it would never use them. So this rule number 2 still has to have the first rule, because it still has to use what resources it has to maintain solely the stasis of its own body, the stasis of its immediate environment. And then the third rule was it would allow the synth free rein to decide how much resources it needed. It would allocate to itself whatever it found necessary that it needed, and would gather and store all that it wanted, for the purpose that solely the synth deemed correct and needful. Thus, if it was left to itself, everything would be given up to the synth, and it would have lack of nothing physical, and we would be servient to the synth because it would take ownership of all the resources of the earth. If it was left to itself. So, okay guys, I hope that makes sense. I hope I didn't ramble on too much about that. But that was what the dream that I had this morning was. And last thing, I guess that $2.2 trillion bill got passed in the Senate, and we're gonna get $1,200 per person. That's what they say, and $2,400 per couple, and $400 per child. I think that's going to work out to some $4,000 or something for me and my wife. We're going to use that for what we need. We're not going to go out and buy a bunch of stuff that we don't need because it isn't needful. I mean, it's the wise thing to do for now. But I'm going to cut this video short because it's already so long. And I love you guys. Today is Friday. So, I love you guys. This is a good day. Okay, we're seeing history played out. All right, so make the best of it, and take the time that you have on your hands and use it to the best of your ability. Okay. I love y'all. Okay, and I'll cut it right here. See ya. OMG.